The eternal passage of the sun barge. In the beginning, before the counting of years, before the naming of stars, there existed only the vast and silent waters of none, the primordial ocean that stretched beyond comprehension, beyond measure, beyond the furthest reach of mortal thought. Within these waters, formless and eternal, there stirred the first consciousness, the first spark of divine awareness that would shape all things to come. The darkness was complete, yet it was not empty. It was full with potential, thick with unmanifested creation, pregnant with the dreams of gods not yet born. From these infinite depths arose Ra, the Golden One, the light-bringer, whose very essence was illumination itself. His emergence was not sudden, not violent, but gradual as the slow unfurling of a lotus blossom at dawn. He rose from the waters with a radiance that had never before existed, a warmth that penetrated the cold void, a presence that gave meaning to space itself. His body gleamed with the soft luster of molten gold, not harsh or blinding, but gentle and pervasive, like honey poured into clear water. His eyes held the depth of all wisdom, and in their gaze, the universe learned to see itself. Ra gazed upon the emptiness and felt within himself the urge to create, not from loneliness, for he was complete unto himself, but from the natural overflow of his being. The way a spring cannot help but flow, the way light cannot help but illuminate. He spoke, and his voice was like the low, resonant hum of the earth itself, a vibration that moved through the waters and gave them purpose. He spoke the names of things not yet born, and in the speaking they came to be. Sky separated from water. Land rose from the depths slowly, grain by grain, forming the first hills, the first valleys, the first gentle slopes, where eventually life would take root and flourish. The world that emerged was vast and quiet, painted in soft hues of amber and ochre, bathed in the perpetual golden light of Ra's presence. He walked upon the new earth, and where his feet touched the ground, the soil grew warm and fertile. He raised his arms to the sky, and the heavens arranged themselves in harmony, the stars taking their positions like patient attendants awaiting instruction. Everything was order. Everything was peace. The cosmos breathed with a slow, measured rhythm, and at the center of it all stood Ra, the eternal sun, the eternal light. Yet Ra understood, with the deep wisdom that was inherent to his nature, that light alone cannot define itself. Without darkness, there is no perception of illumination. Without night, the day has no meaning. Without rest, there can be no true awakening. And so, with deliberate intention, he ordained the cycle that would govern all existence, the journey of the sun across the sky, the descent into the underworld, and the eternal return. This would be his offering to creation, his sacrifice and his gift, repeated without end, without variation, without complaint. He fashioned for himself a vessel worthy of his sacred task, a barge of extraordinary beauty and craftsmanship that existed between the material and the divine. The Manjet, the boat of millions of years, as it would come to be known, was constructed from materials that had no earthly equivalent. Its hull was formed from celestial cedar, wood that grew in gardens beyond mortal reach, trees that absorbed starlight instead of water, that drew sustenance from the breath of eternity itself. The planks were fitted together with such precision that not even the smallest ray of light could pass between them, yet the whole structure remained flexible, able to navigate the treacherous currents of the cosmic river. The prow of the barge curved upward in an elegant arc, carved with hieroglyphs that told stories not yet experienced, prophecies written in a language older than sound. Inlaid along the sides were precious stones that held their own gentle luminescence. Lapis lazuli, the color of the deepest twilight, carnelian like the last ember of a dying fire, turquoise reminiscent of shallow waters beneath a clear sky. These stones were not mere decoration. They served as anchors, tying the vessel to the various realms through which it would pass, allowing it to move between worlds without losing its essential form. At the center of the barge stood a throne, simple in design, yet profound in significance. It was fashioned from a single piece of gold that had never been mined, never been extracted from the earth, but had instead condensed directly from the concentrated essence of sunlight itself. The seat was smooth and warm to the touch, radiating a constant, gentle heat that never burned, never cooled, but remained perfectly balanced, perfectly attuned to the one who would occupy it. Upon this throne, Ra would sit during his daily journey, guiding the sun across the sky, bringing light and life to all the lands below. But the barge would not travel unmanned. Ra, in his wisdom, knew that the journey required guardians, companions, divine beings whose skills and strengths complemented his own. He called forth from the fabric of creation itself an assembly of gods, each one emerging with their own distinct purpose, their own sacred duty to perform aboard the vessel of eternity. First came Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing, whose mind contained all knowledge, all secrets, all the intricate workings of magic and mathematics. Thoth's role was to chart the course, to calculate the precise movements required to navigate the celestial waters, to record each journey in the eternal archives so that the pattern would never be lost, never be forgotten. He moved with a quiet grace, his long beak catching the golden light, his eyes dark and thoughtful, always observing, always contemplating the mysteries that unfolded around him. Beside him stood Horus, the falcon-headed warrior, whose eyes could see across vast distances, who could spot danger long before it manifested, whose courage was as boundless as the sky itself. His body was lean and powerful, built for swift action, yet capable of perfect stillness when stillness was required. Upon his head sat the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, a symbol of his royal authority, his divine right to protect and defend. In his hands he carried a spear of meteoric iron, a weapon forged from a fallen star, its point honed to impossible sharpness, its shaft covered in protective spells written in Thoth's own careful hand. Maat appeared next, though appeared is perhaps the wrong word, for she did not so much arrive as reveal herself, as though she had always been present but only now chose to be perceived. She was the embodiment of truth, justice, and cosmic order, the principle upon which all creation depended. Without Maat, the universe would descend into chaos, the carefully constructed patterns would unravel, and everything would return to the formless void of none. She carried a single ostrich feather, white and perfect, which she held with a gentleness that spoke of its immense importance. This feather was the measure against which all souls would be weighed, the standard of righteousness, the pure and incorruptible truth. Set, the god of storms and desert strength, also took his place upon the barge, and his presence was more complicated, more paradoxical. His head was that of an unidentifiable beast, something that resembled a jackal, yet was not, something that suggested a hound, yet transcended that form. His ears were tall and squared at the tips, his snout long and slightly curved. Where the other gods radiated calm purpose, Set embodied a barely contained energy, a wildness that could be directed but never fully tamed. Yet this wildness was essential, for the journey would require more than wisdom, more than vigilance, more than justice. It would require raw power, the ability to meet chaos with controlled fury, to stand firm against forces that sought to unmake creation itself. Other deities joined as well, each bringing their own gifts to the voyage. Sia, the personification of perception and insight. Hu, the god of authoritative speech, whose words carried the weight of command. Wepwowet, the opener of ways, who cleared the path ahead, ensuring the barge could pass through even the most difficult passages. Together, they formed a crew of divine beings, united in purpose, dedicated to the eternal task of guiding the sun through its endless cycle. Each dawn, the barge would begin its journey at the eastern horizon, emerging from the Duat, the Underworld, the realm of darkness and mystery. The moment of sunrise was a sacred threshold, a transition point where night became day, where the potential became actual, where hope was renewed. Ra would ascend his golden throne, and the barge would begin its stately procession across the sky. The movement was slow and majestic, perfectly paced to allow the world below to receive the sun's life-giving energy gradually, gently, without shock or violence. The sky through which they traveled was not empty space as mortals might imagine it. It was a realm unto itself, a vast ocean of air and light through which currents flowed like invisible rivers. These currents had their own rhythms, their own patterns, and the barge had to navigate them with care and precision. Thoth would stand at the prow, his staff raised, calculating the angles and trajectories, making minute adjustments to account for the subtle variations that occurred from one day to the next. Though the journey appeared identical to those who watched from below, each voyage was unique. Each passage presented its own challenges, its own requirements. As the barge moved across the morning sky, Ra would gaze down upon the world he had created, watching as his light touched the peaks of mountains first, gilding them in shades of rose and gold, then gradually descending into the valleys, illuminating forests and rivers, cities and temples, fields and deserts. He saw everything: the farmer rising to tend his crops, the baker lighting his ovens, the priest opening the temple doors to greet the new day. He saw the ibis waiting in the shallows of the Nile, the hawk circling above the cliffs, the scarab beetle rolling its ball of dung across the sand. Nothing escaped his notice. Nothing was beneath his care. The morning hours were gentle and full of promise. The light was soft, almost tentative, as though testing the world's readiness to receive it. Colors emerged slowly from the monochrome of night: the green of growing things, the blue of water, the countless subtle variations of brown and tan in the desert sands. Shadows shortened as the sun climbed higher, revealing details that had been hidden in darkness, bringing definition to forms that had been merely suggested silhouettes. By midday, when Ra's barge reached its zenith, the light had transformed into something more assertive, more present. It filled every space, penetrated every corner, left nothing hidden or obscure. This was the hour of full illumination, when truth stood revealed, when clarity was absolute. The heat increased, but it was a clean heat, a purifying warmth that drove moisture from the air and created those shimmering mirages in the desert where earth and sky seemed to merge into a single undifferentiated whole. Ra sat motionless upon his throne during these peak hours, his face serene, his eyes half closed, his consciousness expanded to encompass the entire breadth of creation. He could feel the prayers rising from the temples below, the offerings of incense and flowers, the chanted hymns and recited liturgies. He could sense the gratitude of the living things that depended upon his light, the plants turning their leaves to follow his progress, the crops ripening in the fields, the trees growing slowly but steadily toward the sky. The afternoon brought a gradual softening, a mellowing of the light's intensity. The shadows began to lengthen again, stretching eastward as the barge continued its westward journey. The colors shifted toward warmer tones, the blues becoming deeper, the greens taking on a golden cast, the whites turning to cream and then to amber. There was a feeling of completion in these hours, a sense that the day's work was being accomplished, that tasks were being fulfilled, that the natural order was proceeding as it should. The crew of the barge maintained their vigilance throughout, though the daytime journey was generally peaceful, free from the dangers that would manifest after sunset. Still, they remained alert, aware that their sacred duty required constant attention, that complacency was the enemy of order, that the moment one ceased to be watchful was the moment chaos found its opening. As the barge approached the western horizon, the sky began its most dramatic transformation. The sun, which had blazed white and gold at midday, now took on deeper, richer hues. It became orange, then red, then a deep crimson that painted the clouds in shades of fire and blood. The light seemed to thicken, to become almost tangible, like a liquid pouring across the landscape, pooling in the valleys, catching on the edges of clouds, staining the waters of rivers and lakes with reflected glory. This was the hour of endings and transitions, when the day began its surrender to night, when the visible world prepared to retreat into mystery and shadow. The birds returned to their roosts, calling to each other in voices that seemed tinged with melancholy. The nocturnal creatures stirred in their hidden places, sensing that their time was approaching. The air cooled, and a different quality entered the world, something more introspective, more interior. Ra felt this transition deeply, for he knew what lay ahead. The daytime journey, for all its importance, was only half of his sacred duty. The night journey, the passage through the Duat, the realm of the dead and the domain of shadows, was where the true test would occur. It was there, in the darkness beneath the world, that the greatest threat to creation lurked, patient and eternal, waiting with the cold persistence of absolute negation. The barge touched the western horizon, just as the sun became a perfect semicircle, half visible above the edge of the world, half descended into the underworld below. This moment of perfect balance lasted only a breath, only a heartbeat, and then the descent began in earnest. The barge tilted downward, angling into the opening that appeared in the fabric of the world, a gateway between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead. The transition was not abrupt. There was no sudden plunge into darkness, no violent lurch or jarring passage. Instead, the descent was as gradual and measured as everything else about the sun's journey. The light dimmed by degrees, the colors fading through ever deeper shades of red and purple and violet, until finally giving way to a darkness that was complete, absolute, and yet somehow not entirely empty. The Duat was a realm unlike any other, a place that existed outside the normal rules of space and time, where the concepts of up and down, near and far became fluid and unreliable. It was a landscape of the spirit, a geography of consciousness, shaped by belief and will rather than physical law. Here dwelt the souls of the deceased, those who had passed through the weighing of the heart, whose spirits now resided in the field of reeds, a paradise that mirrored the best of the living world, but without its sufferings, its disappointments, its inevitable decline. But the Duat also contained regions of trial and testing, places where souls were purified, where the residue of earthly existence was burned away, where transformation occurred through ordeal and revelation. There were halls filled with strange beings, guardians with multiple heads and hybrid forms, gatekeepers who challenged all who approached, demanding passwords and proofs of worthiness. There were lakes of fire and caverns of ice, deserts that stretched beyond measure, and labyrinthine passages that twisted back upon themselves. Through all of this, the solar barge had to pass, following a route that had been established at the beginning of time, a path that could not be deviated from without risking the collapse of the entire cosmic order. The journey was divided into 12 hours, corresponding to the 12 hours of night in the world above, each hour representing a distinct region of the Duat, each presenting its own characteristics and challenges. The gods aboard the barge transformed as well, adapting to the requirements of the underworld journey. Ra himself changed, merging with Osiris, the god of the dead, becoming Ra Osiris, a composite deity who embodied both the living solar power and the deep wisdom of death and rebirth. This transformation was necessary, for the underworld could only be navigated by one who understood its nature from within, who could speak its language, who could claim legitimate authority in the realm of shadows. The barge was met at the entrance to the Duat by spirits of the deceased who had been assigned the sacred task of towing the vessel through the more difficult passages. They took up ropes woven from moonlight and shadow and began to pull, chanting ancient songs whose melodies had never been heard in the living world, whose words spoke of mysteries too profound for mortal comprehension. Their voices blended together in harmonies that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the underworld, echoing and re-echoing until it was impossible to determine where the sound originated or where it ended. The first hours of the night journey were relatively calm, passing through regions populated by righteous souls who had earned their place in the afterlife. These spirits would gather along the banks of the underworld river to watch the solar barge pass, raising their hands in gestures of reverence and gratitude. Ra's light, even diminished as it was in this realm, still brought them comfort and hope, a reminder that they had not been forgotten, that the gods still maintained their watch, that the cycle would continue, and that order would prevail over chaos. Thoth consulted his scrolls and tablets, comparing the current journey to all the thousands upon thousands that had preceded it, looking for patterns, anomalies, any indication of what might lie ahead. His knowledge was vast but not absolute, for the Duat was a realm of constant change beneath its appearance of timeless stability. What was true in one passage might be different in the next. What worked as protection during one journey might prove insufficient during another. Horus stood at the prow, his keen eyes penetrating the darkness, his spear at the ready, his entire being focused and alert. He knew that the early hours were deceptive in their tranquility, that the real danger would come later, in the deeper regions of the Duat, in the 7th hour when the path passed closest to the domain of the great enemy. Set prowled the deck of the barge like a caged storm, his energy barely contained, his muscles tensed for action. This was his element, the confrontation with chaos, the battle against the forces that sought to destroy all that had been created. During the day, his presence on the barge was somewhat superfluous, his aggressive strength unnecessary. But here in the darkness he came into his own. He found his purpose. He became essential. Mott remained still and centered, her feather held before her like a lantern, though it emitted no visible light. Her role was not to fight, but to maintain, to preserve the fundamental order upon which everything depended. As long as she held her position, as long as she remained true to her nature, the barge had a foundation, a reference point, a reason to continue. The darkness deepened as they descended further into the Duat. This was not the simple absence of light that characterized ordinary night. This was a darkness that possessed substance and weight, that pressed against the hull of the barge, that sought to penetrate the sacred space protected by the gods. It was the darkness of uncreation, the shadow of the primordial void, the echo of the nothingness that had existed before Ra first rose from the waters of none. Strange sounds drifted through this darkness, whispers that might have been voices or might have been nothing more than the movement of currents in the Underworld river. There were glimpses of forms at the edge of perception, shapes that suggested beings but never fully resolved into clarity. The air, if it could be called air, was thick and difficult, requiring effort to move through, as though the barge were pushing against an invisible resistance. The walls of the passage through which they traveled were inscribed with hieroglyphs that glowed faintly with their own phosphorescence, creating just enough illumination to suggest the vast scale of the architecture. These were not natural caverns, but deliberately constructed halls, built by powers and for purposes that predated even the gods themselves. The ceiling stretched upward into blackness beyond measure. The floor below the river was equally distant and equally unknowable. In the 4th hour of night, the barge entered the region known as the Land of Sokar, a particularly desolate and dangerous area of the Duat. Here, the river ceased to flow, the water becoming thick and stagnant, almost solid. The barge could no longer sail but had to be dragged across the sand by the divine servants, their chanting taking on a more labored quality, the effort visible in their movements even though they were spirits and should have been beyond physical exhaustion. This was a realm of absolute stillness, where nothing grew, nothing changed, nothing moved except for the passage of the solar barge. It was a memorial to entropy, a monument to the heat death that awaited all things if the cycle were ever to be broken. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the scraping of the barge's hull across the sand, a sound like the grinding of millstones, like the slow crushing of mountains into dust. Ra sat immobile upon his throne, his light reduced to barely an ember, a faint glow that extended only a few feet from his body. This diminishment was necessary, for in this region, too much light would attract unwanted attention, would alert forces best left undisturbed. The journey through Sokar's realm was one of endurance, of patience, of maintaining existence at the lowest possible level while still remaining coherent and purposeful. But they passed through, as they had always passed through, and eventually the sand gave way to water once more, the river resuming its flow, the passage opening into larger chambers. The 5th hour brought them into regions where judgment took place, where the weighing of hearts occurred, where souls learned their ultimate fate. Great halls stretched away on either side, filled with beings of immense power and terrible aspect, judges whose verdicts were final and absolute, whose scales could not be deceived or influenced. Massive pillars rose from the river's edge, each one carved from a single piece of stone that had never existed in the earthly realm, stone that was quarried from the foundations of consciousness itself. Upon these pillars were depicted the deeds of humanity, both noble and base, a comprehensive record of moral choice extending back to the first moment when a being possessed sufficient awareness to distinguish right from wrong. Ra observed all of this with neither approval nor condemnation, for he was beyond such judgments. His role was not to evaluate but to illuminate, not to reward or punish but simply to be, to maintain his presence, to continue his journey. The judgments rendered here were the domain of Osiris and his court. The weighing of hearts was performed by Anubis. The declarations of worthiness or unworthiness were spoken by Thoth. Ra was the constant, the light that made all things visible, but not the arbiter of what should be done with what was seen. The sixth hour brought a subtle but profound change in the atmosphere of the Duat. The darkness acquired a different quality, becoming not merely the absence of light, but an active presence, a force with intention and will. The temperature dropped, though temperature in this realm was more a psychic phenomenon than a physical one. A coldness entered that had nothing to do with heat or its absence, and everything to do with a fundamental hostility to existence itself. The gods on the barge sensed this shift immediately. Horus tightened his grip on his spear, his eyes scanning the darkness with renewed intensity. Set's prowling became more aggressive, his movements those of a predator preparing for combat. Thoth's calculations accelerated, his hands moving rapidly across his tablets, checking and rechecking the protective spells that warded the barge. Mot's feather began to glow more brightly, as though responding to a challenge, asserting its truth against encroaching falsehood. Ra felt it as well, a familiar presence approaching from ahead, from the deepest region of the Duat, from the place where the seventh hour would unfold. It was a presence he had confronted countless times before, an enemy he had defeated more times than could be numbered, yet an enemy who could never be permanently destroyed, who would return again and again, eternally renewed in malice and hunger, forever opposed to the ordered cosmos. The passage narrowed as they entered the seventh hour, the walls closing in on either side, the ceiling descending until it seemed the barge would surely be crushed or forced to halt. But the dimensions of the Duat were not fixed, and the barge adjusted as well, becoming smaller or the passage becoming larger, the relationship between vessel and environment constantly renegotiating itself according to rules that defied rational analysis. And then, from ahead, came a sound unlike any other in the underworld. It was a hissing that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once, from the walls and the water and the very air itself. It was the sound of scales sliding across stone, of something immense moving through confined spaces, of coils tightening and loosening with deliberate, patient menace. It was a sound that struck directly at the most primal levels of consciousness, triggering instinctive fear, evoking memories of humanity's most ancient adversaries. The darkness ahead began to shift and move, to coalesce into a form that defied the eye's attempt to comprehend it. It was serpentine, that much was clear, but its size was impossible to determine, for it seemed to extend beyond the boundaries of space, to exist in multiple locations simultaneously, to be both near and infinitely distant. Its scales were not merely black, but appeared to absorb light, creating voids in the visual field, gaps in perception that the mind struggled to process. This was Apophis, the world serpent, the enemy of Ra, the embodiment of chaos and disorder, the living negation of everything the solar deity represented. Apophis had existed as long as Ra, perhaps longer, emerging from the same primordial waters but choosing opposition rather than creation, destruction rather than building, entropy rather than order. He was not evil in the moral sense, for morality requires consciousness and choice, and Apophis was more fundamental than that. He was the principle of unmaking, the force that sought to return all things to the formless void, the eternal opponent of the structured cosmos. The serpent's head emerged from the darkness, immense beyond description, with eyes that were not really eyes but rather absences, black holes that pulled at the light, that threatened to draw in and extinguish anything that came too close. His mouth gaped open, revealing not teeth but a darkness deeper still, an interior that suggested an infinite regression, a throat that led not to a stomach but to oblivion itself. The mere presence of Apophis caused the waters of the underworld river to roil and churn, waves forming where there should be no waves, currents running in contradictory directions, the fundamental nature of liquid becoming uncertain. The walls of the passage trembled, hieroglyphs flickering and fading as the order they represented was challenged by the proximity of ultimate chaos. Ra rose from his throne, and though his light was diminished in this deep region of the Duat, he began to glow more brightly, asserting his solar nature against the darkness that sought to overwhelm it. His face remained calm, showing neither fear nor anger, for he had faced this moment innumerable times, and he would face it innumerable times more. This was his burden and his purpose, the price of maintaining creation, the eternal struggle that gave meaning to existence. Set stepped forward, placing himself between Ra and the approaching serpent, his body tense and ready, every muscle defined and prepared for explosive action. This was the moment he had been waiting for through all the peaceful hours of daylight, through all the calm early passages of the night journey. This was where his nature found its fullest expression, where his barely controlled wildness became not a liability but the most essential asset the sun barge possessed. Apophis struck, not with the slow deliberation of an ordinary serpent, but with a speed that seemed to bypass the normal flow of time entirely. One moment his head was at a distance, the next it was upon the barge, jaws wide enough to swallow the entire vessel, to consume Ra and all his divine crew, to end the journey and plunge creation into eternal night. But Set was ready. His spear flashed upward, moving with equal impossible speed, meeting the serpent's descending strike with precisely calculated force and angle. The point, forged from star metal and inscribed with Thoth's most powerful spells, pierced the roof of Apophis's mouth, penetrating deep into the darkness beyond, finding purchase where there should be no solid substance to anchor against. The serpent recoiled, his hiss intensifying into a sound that resonated through the entire Duat, shaking the foundations of the Underworld, causing distant chambers to collapse, sending shock waves through the realms of the dead. But this was only the beginning of the confrontation, not its conclusion. Apophis had been wounded countless times before and had always returned, always renewed his assault, always found the strength to attack again. Thoth began to chant, his voice cutting through the chaos with the clarity of absolute knowledge. The words he spoke were not merely sounds, but keys, each syllable unlocking specific aspects of reality, each phrase reinforcing the barriers between order and chaos, between existence and void. The hieroglyphs on the walls of the passage blazed to life, responding to his invocation, adding their power to the defense of the solar barge. Mott stepped forward as well, holding her feather before her like a shield. Where it pointed, the chaos calmed slightly, the roiling waters settling, the trembling walls stabilizing. Truth was her weapon, and against it even Apophis had to acknowledge limits, for absolute chaos cannot exist where absolute truth remains firm. She spoke no words, but her presence itself was a declaration, a standing affirmation that order had primacy, that structure preceded destruction, that being was more fundamental than non-being. Horus joined the battle as well, his falcon's cry piercing the darkness, his divine vision perceiving weak points in the serpent's form that others could not see. He directed Set's strikes, calling out targets, coordinating the defense with the precision of a master strategist. His role was not merely to fight, but to ensure the fighting was effective, that energy was not wasted, that every action served the larger purpose of protecting the barge and its sacred passenger. Ra remained standing, his light growing steadily brighter, pushing back against the darkness that Apophis brought with him. This was the crucial element of the battle, for Apophis fed on darkness, drew his strength from the absence of light, became more powerful the deeper the shadows grew. By maintaining and even increasing his radiance in the depths of the seventh hour, Ra was denying the serpent his source of power, limiting his effectiveness, constraining the scope of his assault. The battle raged for what seemed like hours, but was actually only a span of minutes, for time in the Duat flowed according to different rules, stretching and compressing in response to the intensity of events occurring within it. Apophis coiled and struck, attempted to wrap himself around the barge, to crush it within his coils, to squeeze until the divine wood splintered and the gods were cast into the dark waters. But Set met every attack with his spear and his strength, his wild energy perfectly matched to the chaos he opposed. The spells of Thoth wove a protective net around the vessel, creating barriers that the serpent could not cross, establishing boundaries that even his formless nature had to respect. Each time Apophis attempted a new approach, a new angle of attack, he found the way blocked, the passage sealed, the route defended by layers of magical protection that drew on powers as ancient and fundamental as the serpent himself. And gradually, inexorably, the balance began to shift. Apophis, for all his terrible power, could not overcome the combined might of the gods aboard the solar barge. Set's spear found its mark again and again, each wound draining a portion of the serpent's strength. Thoth's spells accumulated, layer upon layer, until they formed a cage of light and meaning that contained and confined. Mot's truth established a perimeter that chaos could not cross. Horus's vision anticipated and countered every new tactic. Most importantly, Ra's light continued to grow, to expand, to fill the seventh hour with an illumination that should not have been possible in this deepest region of the Duat. The darkness that was Apophis's element began to dissipate, to thin, to lose its substance and potency. The serpent's movements became slower, more labored, as though he were pushing against an increasingly resistant medium. With a final massive effort, Set drove his spear deep into the serpent's skull, not to kill, for Apophis could not be killed, but to force him to withdraw, to retreat back into the deepest shadows of the Duat, to abandon his attack and concede this night's battle. The serpent's enormous body convulsed, coils thrashing in the dark waters, sending up waves that crashed against the walls of the passage. His hiss became a roar of frustration and rage, a sound of pure, inarticulate hatred for the light, for order, for the relentless cycle that he could disrupt but never truly break. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, Apophis was gone, sinking back into the depths from which he had emerged, dissolving into the darkness that was his true home. The waters calmed, the walls ceased their trembling. The oppressive presence that had filled the seventh hour lifted, leaving behind only the normal heavy atmosphere of the Duat. Set stood breathing heavily at the prow of the barge, his spear still raised, his body still tensed for combat, unwilling to immediately accept that the battle was over. Slowly, as the moments passed and no renewed attack came, he allowed himself to relax slightly, though his vigilance remained absolute. This battle was won, but the war was eternal, and tomorrow night, in this same hour, in this same place, the confrontation would occur again. Thoth lowered his hands, the flow of spells ceasing, though their effects would remain in place, gradually fading as the barge moved beyond the seventh hour. He made notes on his tablets, recording the details of this particular encounter, comparing them to previous battles, looking for patterns that might provide insight into future confrontations. Horus allowed himself a small nod of satisfaction, acknowledging the effectiveness of their coordinated defense. Mot returned to her position, her feather dimming back to its normal subtle glow, her expression serene and unchanged, for she had never doubted the outcome, had never wavered in her certainty that truth would prevail. Ra slowly lowered himself back onto his throne, his light diminishing once more to a level appropriate for the remaining hours of the night journey. He felt the weight of the confrontation, not as physical exhaustion, for gods do not tire in that way, but as a deep awareness of the eternal burden he carried, the endless responsibility that came with being the sun, the light-bringer, the one upon whom all creation depended. The barge moved forward, leaving the seventh hour behind, entering the eighth hour where the atmosphere began to lighten, where the promise of eventual return to the upper world started to manifest. The worst was past. The greatest danger had been faced and overcome. What remained was the slow ascent back toward the living world, the gradual transition from the realm of death to the realm of life. In the eighth hour, they passed through regions where souls underwent their final transformations, where the last attachments to earthly existence were released, where the dead truly became the blessed dead, ready to inhabit the field of reeds in peace and contentment. These souls called out to Ra as the barge passed, their voices filled with gratitude and joy, for his successful passage through the dangers of the Duat meant that the sun would rise again, that the world would continue, that the cycle of creation would persist for another day. The ninth hour brought them to the place where the waters of the underworld began to flow upward, defying normal gravity, climbing toward the eastern horizon where dawn would soon break. The barge began to rise with them, angling. The barge continued its ascent through the rising waters, moving with the unhurried grace of all things divine, following currents that flowed against the pull of earthly gravity, responding instead to laws that governed the celestial realm. The transformation from the depths of the Duat to the approach of dawn was not instantaneous but gradual, unfolding across the remaining hours of night, with the same measured patience that characterized every aspect of Ra's eternal journey. The ninth hour revealed landscapes of subtle beauty, regions where the harsh trials of the deeper underworld gave way to gentler territories. Here, the souls who had successfully passed through judgment engaged in activities that brought them joy and fulfillment, tending gardens that grew without need of earthly soil, sailing boats upon waters that never stormed or grew turbulent, reuniting with loved ones who had preceded them into the afterlife. These souls moved with a serenity that came from the absolute certainty of their place in the cosmic order, freed from the doubts and anxieties that plagued the living, existing in a state of perpetual contentment. The walls of the passage through which the barge traveled began to show signs of the approaching transition. The stone, which had been dark and close-grained in the deeper regions, became lighter in color and texture, shot through with veins of crystal that caught and reflected Ra's light, creating soft sparkles that danced across the surfaces like stars emerging at twilight. The hieroglyphs carved into these walls depicted scenes of renewal and rebirth, showing the sun rising over the eastern horizon, showing fields being sown with grain, showing life returning to the world after the dormancy of night. Water dripped from the ceiling in slow, rhythmic drops, each one creating concentric circles on the surface of the underground river, patterns that expanded outward and intersected with other patterns, forming geometries of exquisite complexity that existed for only a moment before dissolving back into the general flow. The sound of these drops was like a gentle percussion, a natural music that provided a subtle counterpoint to the chanting of the spirits who still pulled the barge, their voices never faltering, their rhythm never varying. Thoth stood near the stern, his tablets now put aside, his hands folded before him in an attitude of contemplation. The acute vigilance required during the passage through the seventh hour had eased, allowing him to enter a different mode of consciousness, one more reflective and philosophical. He gazed at the passing walls with eyes that saw not just the physical stone, but the layers of meaning encoded within it, the accumulated wisdom of countless generations, the deep truths that could only be expressed through symbol and metaphor. The ibis god's thoughts turned to the cyclical nature of existence, the endless repetition that was not mere monotony, but rather a profound expression of cosmic stability. Each journey through the Duat was simultaneously identical to all those that had preceded it and utterly unique, containing subtle variations that prevented stagnation while maintaining essential continuity. This paradox was at the heart of creation itself, the balance between permanence and change, between the eternal and the ephemeral. Beside him, Mot had resumed her characteristic stillness, her feather held loosely in one hand, her face composed in an expression of perfect equanimity. She existed in a state of continuous alignment with the fundamental order of the universe, never needing to strive or struggle to maintain her position, because her position was not something separate from her essential nature. She was truth, and truth was her, and this complete identity meant she could never be displaced or diminished, regardless of the chaos that swirled around her. Set had moved to the center of the barge, his wild energy slowly subsiding now that the immediate threat had passed. He cleaned his spear with a cloth that never seemed to soil, removing the dark ichor of Apophis that clung to the meteoric iron, restoring the weapon to its pristine state. His movements were methodical and precise, a ritualistic action that helped him transition from the heightened state of combat readiness back to a more sustainable level of awareness. Yet even in this quieter mode, he remained fundamentally alert, a coiled spring that could release its energy in an instant if danger threatened. Horus had returned to his position at the prow, though his spear was now held loosely rather than raised for immediate use. His falcon's eyes continued to scan the darkness ahead, but the tension in his posture had eased. He knew the topography of the Duat as intimately as Ra himself, understood the rhythms and patterns of the night journey, recognized that the passage through the remaining hours would be far less perilous than what they had already endured. Ra sat upon his golden throne, his hands resting gently on the armrests, his eyes half closed but not sleeping, for gods do not sleep in the way mortals do. Instead, he maintained a state of restful awareness, simultaneously fully present and yet detached, observing without grasping, experiencing without attachment. The light that emanated from his form had stabilized at a level appropriate for these transitional hours, bright enough to illuminate the immediate vicinity, but not so bright as to overwhelm the subtle beauties of the surrounding landscape. The 10th hour brought them into a region known as the Waters of Osiris, a vast subterranean lake that stretched beyond the limits of vision, its surface absolutely still, reflecting the distant ceiling like a perfect mirror. The barge moved across this expanse with barely a ripple, the hull so precisely balanced that it seemed to float a hair's breadth above the water rather than actually touching it. The silence here was profound, not oppressive like the silence of Sokar's realm, but peaceful, contemplative, inviting introspection and interior quiet. Islands rose from the lake at irregular intervals, each one supporting a small temple or shrine dedicated to various aspects of the divine mystery. These structures were simple in design, consisting of open pavilions with pillars but no walls, allowing the air to move freely through them, creating subtle variations in the shadows cast by Ra's passing light. Some were made of white limestone that glowed softly in the dimness. Others were constructed from black granite that absorbed the light, creating negative spaces, zones of deeper darkness that somehow enhanced rather than diminished the overall sense of serenity. On the shores of these islands stood figures that were neither fully divine nor entirely mortal, intermediate beings who had achieved a state of spiritual development that elevated them above ordinary human consciousness but had not crossed the final threshold into complete divinity. They wore simple white robes that stirred gently in the minimal breeze, and they raised their hands in gestures of blessing as the solar barge passed, offering their respect and gratitude to Ra and his companions. The barge did not stop at these islands, for its journey could not be interrupted without risking the delicate timing that ensured the sun rose at precisely the correct moment. Yet Ra acknowledged each group of figures with a slight inclination of his head, a small gesture that nevertheless carried immense significance, a validation of their spiritual work, a recognition of their achievement. The figures bowed in return, deeply and slowly, then remained in that position long after the barge had passed from view, holding the posture as a meditation, a physical expression of reverence and humility. The ceiling above the waters of Osiris was adorned with a representation of the night sky as it appeared in the world above, though rendered in precious stones rather than actual stars. Lapis lazuli formed the background, its deep blue surface flecked with gold that suggested distant stellar fire. Individual stars were picked out in diamonds and clear quartz, positioned according to the constellations that governed the various seasons and agricultural cycles. The moon, in its current phase, was depicted in silver that had been polished until it gleamed with cold brilliance. This celestial map was not merely decorative, but served a practical purpose, allowing Thoth to verify their position and progress, to ensure that the barge remained synchronized with the movements of the heavens, that the transition from night to day would occur at the proper moment and in the proper location. He consulted it periodically, making minute mental adjustments to the course, corrections so small they would be imperceptible to any observer, but that accumulated over the hours to ensure absolute precision. As they crossed the waters of Osiris, the quality of the air began to change in ways that were more psychological than physical. There was a sense of approaching culmination, of a long journey nearing its destination, of effort about to be rewarded. This was not the anxious anticipation of uncertainty, but rather the calm certainty of inevitability, the knowledge that what was meant to happen would happen, that the pattern would complete itself as it had always completed itself, that the sunrise was not merely possible but absolutely guaranteed. The 11th hour arrived with a subtle shift in the ambient light, a barely perceptible lessening of the absolute darkness that had characterized the deep Duat. This was not yet actual dawn, but rather the first hint of its approach, the way the sky begins to show the faintest trace of gray at the eastern horizon long before the sun itself appears. The change was so gradual that it would be impossible to point to any single moment and say, "Here, this is where it began." Yet over the course of minutes it became undeniable that transformation was underway. The waters of Osiris gave way to a river once more, narrower than before, flowing with increased speed now that it was climbing toward the upper world. The banks rose steeply on either side, carved from living rock into smooth vertical faces that showed the marks of ancient tools, evidence of labor performed in epochs beyond memory. These walls were covered with inscriptions, not the formal hieroglyphs of the earlier passages, but more informal writings, prayers and petitions left by souls who had passed through this region, messages of hope and gratitude, declarations of faith and trust in the eternal cycle. Some of these inscriptions were remarkably ancient, their surfaces worn nearly smooth by the passage of time and the constant movement of air through the passage. Others were more recent, their symbols still sharp and clearly defined, their pigments still retaining traces of color. Thoth read them as the barge passed, absorbing their contents into his infinite memory, adding them to the vast archive of mortal aspiration and divine response that he maintained. The spirits who pulled the barge began to sing a different song now, one that spoke of endings and new beginnings, of darkness giving way to light, of sleep yielding to wakefulness. The melody was ancient beyond measure, predating even the earliest human civilizations, going back to the very first time Ra had made this journey, when the cycle was new and the pattern was still being established. Yet it remained ever fresh, ever relevant, for the truths it expressed were timeless and universal. Ra could feel the pull of the upper world growing stronger, a gentle but insistent force that drew him toward the eastern horizon, toward the place where he would emerge from the Duat and resume his visible presence in the sky. This pull was both external and internal, simultaneously a feature of cosmic mechanics and a longing within his own divine nature, a desire to complete the cycle, to fulfill his purpose, to bring light once more to the world that depended upon him. The 11th hour also brought them past monuments to various deities associated with the dawn, gods and goddesses who governed that liminal time when night surrendered to day, when the world hung suspended between states, when transformation was most possible. Shrines to Khepri, the scarab-headed god who represented the sun at dawn, who pushed the solar disk across the sky just as the earthly scarab pushed its ball of dung across the sand. Altars to Hathor, who in one of her aspects was the goddess of the eastern horizon, who welcomed Ra each morning with music and celebration. These monuments were tended by spirits specifically assigned to that duty, beings who had chosen to dedicate their afterlife existence to the maintenance of these sacred sites. They swept the stone floors with brooms made from papyrus reeds, cleared away the minimal dust that accumulated even in this timeless realm, ensured that the offering bowls were always filled with symbolic food and drink. They worked in complete silence, their movements slow and meditative, their faces expressing a contentment that came from performing meaningful labor in service of purposes greater than themselves. The barge passed close enough to one of these monuments that Ra could see the details of its construction, the way each stone had been cut to fit perfectly with its neighbors, creating joints so tight that not even a blade of grass could have grown between them. The precision was not merely technical, but spiritual, an expression of the belief that physical perfection reflected metaphysical truth, that outer harmony mirrored inner alignment, that beauty in the material realm was a window into transcendent reality. The walls of the passage began to angle upward more steeply now, the barge climbing along a gradient that would have been impossible for any ordinary vessel, but that presented no difficulty for the magical craft that bore the sun god. The water flowed swiftly here, white foam forming where it tumbled over rocks and obstacles, the sound of its movement becoming louder, filling the passage with a rushing susurration that was simultaneously energizing and soothing. Set stood at the rail of the barge, looking back toward the depths they had left behind, his expression unreadable. The battle with Apophis was over for this night, but he knew it would be renewed tomorrow, and the day after that, and for all the days to come until the end of time itself. This knowledge might have bred despair in a lesser being, the sense that nothing was ever truly accomplished, that all effort was ultimately futile. But Set understood what mortals often failed to grasp, that the value of action lay not in achieving a permanent result, but in the action itself, in the commitment, in the stand taken against chaos, regardless of whether that stand could ever be final. Horus had moved to stand beside him, and the two gods remained there in companionable silence, the warrior and the storm, the principle of righteous kingship and the principle of wild strength, different in nature but united in purpose. They had fought together countless times, would fight together countless times more, and in that endless repetition they found not monotony but meaning, not futility but fulfillment. Maud approached and joined them, her feather now tucked into her belt, her hands hanging loosely at her sides. She gazed not backward toward the deep Duat, nor forward toward the approaching dawn, but rather into the present moment, fully inhabiting the exact instant in which she existed, neither regretting the past nor anticipating the future. This was her gift and her teaching, the wisdom she embodied, that truth existed only in the now, that the present moment was the only place where reality could be directly encountered, that past and future were mental constructs that, while useful, should never be allowed to obscure the primacy of what was actually occurring. Thoth remained at his post, but he allowed himself to relax slightly, to release the intense focus that had been necessary during the more dangerous hours. His tablets were stowed away now, his calculations complete, his duties for this night's journey nearly fulfilled. Soon they would emerge into the upper world, and his role would shift from navigator and protector to scribe and counselor, recording the events of the day, advising Ra on matters that required his particular wisdom. The 12th and final hour of the night journey began with a transformation of the passage itself. The carved stone walls gave way to something more organic, tunnels that seemed to have been formed by natural processes rather than deliberate construction. The rock here was different, layered sedimentary stone in shades of red and orange and gold, colors that anticipated the hues of dawn. Water had seeped through it over countless ages, depositing minerals that formed delicate formations, curtains of stone that hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls, columns that rose from the floor like the trunks of stone trees. The river became narrower still, and the barge had to navigate carefully between projections of rock that jutted out from the banks, obstacles that required subtle adjustments to the course, minor corrections that Thoth directed with slight gestures. The spirits pulling the barge moved with increased energy now, sensing the nearness of their destination, feeling the pull of the upper world that grew stronger with each moment. Light began to appear ahead, not the golden radiance of Ra, but a grayer, more diffuse illumination that filtered down from above, from the world of the living that awaited just beyond the final barrier between the Duat and the daylight realm. This was the pre-dawn light, the time when darkness had not yet fully retreated, but when its dominance was clearly ending, when shadows began to lose their depth and solidity, when the world existed in shades of gray rather than absolute black and white. The barge entered the final chamber of the Duat, a vast cavern whose ceiling was the underside of the eastern horizon itself. This was the place of transformation, where the night sun became the day sun, where Ra Osiris separated back into distinct entities, where the gods in their vessel prepared for the transition from the realm of the dead to the realm of the living. The chamber was supported by pillars of such immense size that their full height was lost in the dimness above. Each pillar was carved from a single piece of stone, quarried from mountains that no longer existed in the earthly realm, transported by methods that predated the age of human civilization. They were decorated with scenes that depicted the journey just completed, showing the barge at various stages of its passage through the 12 hours, showing the confrontation with Apophis, showing the safe arrival at this chamber of transformation. At the center of the chamber was a pool of perfectly still water, fed by streams that descended from 4 directions, representing the cardinal points, the 4 corners of creation. The barge came to rest at the edge of this pool, and the spirits who had been pulling it released their ropes and stepped back, their task completed. They bowed deeply to Ra and his companions, then faded gradually from view, returning to whatever regions of the Duat they called home. their work for this night finished. Ra rose from his throne and stepped down onto the stone floor of the chamber, his feet touching the ancient rock with a tenderness that spoke of profound respect for this sacred place. He walked slowly toward the pool at the center, his movements measured and deliberate, each step a conscious choice, each placement of his foot a small ritual in itself. The other gods followed at a respectful distance, forming a loose procession, maintaining the natural order that governed their relationships. Thoth came first, his ibis head held high, his staff tapping softly on the stone floor. Then Horus, his spear carried vertically now, a staff of office rather than a weapon. Set followed, his wild energy subdued but never absent, always present beneath the surface. Mot came last, her feather glowing softly in the gray light, her presence creating a sense of stability and rightness. At the edge of the pool, Ra paused and gazed down into the water. The surface acted as a mirror, reflecting not his current appearance, but rather showing him as he would be in the upper world, the fully manifested sun god in all his radiant glory. This reflection was more than mere image. It was a promise and a prophecy, a guarantee that the transformation would occur, that the cycle would complete itself once more. He knelt slowly, his knees touching the stone, his hands extending over the water. He did not touch the surface, but held his palms a few inches above it, feeling the subtle energy that rose from the depths, the power of the primordial waters that still existed here at this threshold between worlds. These were the same waters from which he had first emerged at the beginning of creation, the source from which all things came and to which all things would eventually return. The other gods arranged themselves around the pool, creating a circle, each taking a position that corresponded to their particular nature and function. Thoth to the east, the direction of wisdom and new beginnings. Horus to the south, the direction of power and kingship. Set to the north, the direction of storms and challenges. Mot to the west, the direction of truth and the setting sun, the completion of cycles. Together they began to chant, their voices blending in harmonies that had no earthly equivalent, sounds that resonated not just in the air, but in the fabric of reality itself. The words were in a language that predated all mortal tongues, syllables that were pure meaning unencumbered by the limitations of human speech. They sang of light emerging from darkness, of life conquering death, of order prevailing over chaos, of the eternal return of that which had been lost. As they chanted, the water in the pool began to glow, softly at first, then with increasing intensity. The light came from within the depths, rising toward the surface, transforming the water from ordinary liquid into something more fundamental, more essential. This was the light of creation itself, the same radiance that had existed at the very beginning, before the formation of the world, before the naming of things, before the separation of heaven and earth. Ra lowered his hands until they touched the water's surface, and the moment of contact sent ripples spreading outward in perfect concentric circles. Where the ripples reached the edges of the pool, they transformed into waves of light that washed over the assembled gods, bathing them in radiance, renewing their strength, restoring their power after the long night's journey. The ceiling of the chamber began to change, the solid rock becoming translucent, then transparent, revealing the sky of the upper world beyond. Stars were still visible, but they were fading now, their light becoming pale and weak as the true dawn approached. The eastern horizon showed a band of lighter color, gray becoming tinged with the faintest suggestion of pink, the first hint of the rose and gold that would soon paint the entire sky. Ra stood, water dripping from his hands, each drop falling back into the pool with a sound like a bell, clear and pure and resonant. His form began to shimmer and shift, the diminished night aspect giving way to the full glory of the day sun. His skin brightened until it gleamed like polished gold. His eyes blazed with light that was warm but not burning, intense but not painful to behold. He grew in stature, not physically larger but more present, more commanding, more undeniably real. The transformation was both instant and gradual, accomplished in a moment, yet also unfolding across a span of time. This was one of the paradoxes of divine existence, the way contradictory truths could both be valid, the way linear time and eternal now could coexist without conflict. Ra was simultaneously the being who had descended into the Duat 12 hours ago and an entirely renewed deity, both the same and different, continuous and transformed. He turned to face the east, toward the barrier that still separated the Duat from the upper world, the final obstacle between night and day. This barrier was not physical but metaphysical, a boundary maintained by will and tradition rather than matter and force. It existed because it needed to exist, because the sharp distinction between the realm of the dead and the realm of the living served an essential purpose in the structure of creation. But each dawn, this barrier had to be crossed, and the crossing was Ra's responsibility and privilege. He raised his hands toward the eastern wall of the chamber, and light streamed from his palms, golden rays that struck the boundary and began to dissolve it. The process was neither violent nor abrupt, but rather like watching ice melt in spring sunshine, a gradual yielding, a soft surrender to inevitable change. The wall became less solid, less opaque, taking on a quality like colored glass, allowing light to pass through while still maintaining some degree of separation. Then it became like mist, substantial enough to be seen but no longer a true barrier. Finally it dispersed entirely, wisps of gray vapor that curled and drifted on a breeze that came from the upper world, carrying with it the scents of the living earth, soil and growing things, water and stone, the complex perfume of a world awakening. The barge, which had been resting at the edge of the pool, began to move again of its own accord, gliding across the water toward the opening that Ra had created. The transition was seamless, one realm flowing into the next without any jarring discontinuity. The gods took their positions aboard the vessel once more, resuming their posts for the day journey that would follow this night passage. But before the barge passed through into the upper world, Ra paused and looked back at the chamber they were leaving, at the pool of primordial water, at the massive pillars that held up the roof of the Duat. This moment of reflection was important, acknowledgement of what had been accomplished, a recognition that the night journey was no less sacred than the day journey, that the passage through darkness was essential to the appreciation of light. Thoth made a final notation on his tablets, recording the exact moment of transition, the precise instant when night became day. This record would be added to all the others, building an archive that stretched back to the beginning of time, a comprehensive account of every sunrise that had ever occurred. The weight of this accumulated knowledge was immense, yet Thoth bore it without strain, for his capacity for retention was infinite, his memory perfect and complete. Horus scanned the world beyond the opening, his keen vision assessing the state of the land, checking for any threats or disturbances that might require divine intervention. All was as it should be. The Nile flowed gently between its banks, still in the gray pre-dawn light. The desert stretched away to east and west, sand dunes forming smooth curves under the subtle illumination. Villages and cities slept, though early risers were beginning to stir, preparing for the day's work, looking eastward for the first sign of the sun. Set stood ready, though the dangers of the day were far less than those of the night. Still, vigilance was never wasted, and he maintained his alert posture, his spear held casually but available for immediate use if needed. His role during the day journey was more symbolic than practical, a reminder that strength and wildness had their place in the ordered cosmos, that controlled chaos could serve creative purposes. Mot positioned herself at the exact center of the barge, her feather held before her, creating a vertical axis around which everything else was balanced. As long as she maintained her position, as long as she held true to her nature, the barge would remain stable, the journey would proceed smoothly, and creation itself would continue to function according to its established patterns. The barge moved through the opening, crossing the threshold between the Duat and the upper world. The sensation of transition was subtle, like passing from one room to another through a wide doorway, barely noticeable yet unmistakable. The quality of the air changed immediately, becoming fresher, carrying the moisture of the river, the scent of fields ready for planting, the smell of humanity going about its daily business. They emerged into a landscape transformed by the approaching dawn. The gray light had intensified, and the eastern horizon now showed clear bands of color, deep purple at the bottom, then indigo, then violet, then rose, then gold. Stars had vanished except for the brightest, which still clung to visibility in the western sky, reluctant to yield to the advancing day. The barge rose gently into the sky, ascending until it reached the proper height for the sun's journey, neither too high nor too low, but positioned exactly where it needed to be to illuminate the land evenly and effectively. The movement was smooth and controlled, without any sense of effort or strain, as natural as breath, as inevitable as the turning of the seasons. As Ra and his companions took their positions for the day journey, the first direct rays of sunlight broke over the eastern horizon, lancing across the land in shafts of pure golden radiance. Shadows that had pooled and merged during the night suddenly separated and defined themselves, each object casting its own distinct shadow, the world resolving into clarity and detail. In the temples throughout Egypt, priests who had been waiting and watching cried out in joy and relief, just as they did every morning, greeting the sun with hymns and prayers, offering thanks for its return, celebrating the continuation of the cosmic order. They knew, in their wisdom, that the sunrise was not automatic or guaranteed, but rather the result of Ra's successful journey through the Duat, his victory over Apophis, his dedication to the eternal cycle. In homes and villages, people emerged from their dwellings to see the dawn, to feel the first warmth of the sun on their faces, to begin their daily tasks under the watchful eye of the god who had once again proven his commitment to creation. Farmers headed to their fields, carrying tools that caught the morning light and threw it back in bright reflections. Fishermen pushed their boats into the Nile, setting nets in the shallows where fish gathered. Women went to the river to collect water, balancing jars on their heads with practiced ease. The world came alive under Ra's gaze, responding to his presence with renewed energy and purpose. Birds launched themselves from their roosts, filling the air with song, declaring their territories, calling to potential mates. Insects hummed and buzzed among the flowers that opened their petals to receive the sun's rays. Animals that had been sleeping began to move, stretching stiff muscles, searching for food, continuing the endless task of survival. Ra observed all of this with a satisfaction that was both personal and transpersonal, simultaneously the pleasure of a creator seeing his work flourish and the impersonal contentment of natural law fulfilling itself. He was both intimately involved in every detail of the living world and infinitely removed from it, both immanent and transcendent, both here and everywhere, both now and always. The barge sailed on, maintaining its stately pace across the morning sky, the same pace it had maintained for countless millennia, the same pace it would maintain for countless millennia to come. This consistency was not rigidity, but rather the expression of perfect reliability, the assurance that some things could be depended upon absolutely, that the foundation of existence was solid and trustworthy. Thoth had put away his tablets and now stood gazing down at the world with an expression of gentle benevolence. His role during the day was less active than during the night, more observational, watching and recording the events that unfolded below, maintaining the great archive of mortal experience that would eventually inform the judgment of souls in the afterlife. Horus relaxed slightly, allowing himself to appreciate the beauty of the morning, the way the light transformed ordinary landscapes into scenes of subtle grandeur. His warrior's vigilance remained, but it operated in the background of his consciousness, leaving the foreground free to experience the moment without the constant anticipation of threat. Set had moved to the rail of the barge and stood looking down at the desert, his natural domain, the harsh landscape that tested all who entered it, that separated the weak from the strong, that taught lessons about resilience and adaptation. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dunes, creating patterns of light and dark that shifted slowly as the angle of illumination changed. Mot remained at the center, unchanged and unchanging, the still point around which everything else revolved, the truth that gave meaning to all the varied experiences of existence. Her presence was a gift and a challenge, an invitation to align oneself with fundamental reality and a standard against which all choices would be measured. The solar barge continued its journey across the sky, and the morning advanced toward midday. the hours unfolding with the same measured pace that had characterized the night journey, the same attention to detail, the same commitment to fulfilling the sacred task that had been ordained at the beginning of time. The world below changed and developed, grew and declined, experienced joy and suffering, life and death, all under the constant watchful presence of Ra, the eternal sun, the light that would never fail, the center around which all else orbited. In a temple dedicated to Ra, the high priest completed the morning ritual, pouring a libation of water and speaking the words that had been spoken every morning for generations beyond counting. He looked up at the sky, at the sun already climbing toward its zenith, and felt a deep gratitude for the god's faithfulness, for the reliability of the cosmic order, for the knowledge that tomorrow morning he would perform this same ritual again, and the morning after that, and for all the mornings of his life. In the fields, a farmer paused in his work and wiped sweat from his brow, feeling the increasing warmth of the ascending sun. He offered a silent prayer of thanks, not in words, but simply in awareness, in acknowledgement, in the recognition that his life and livelihood depended absolutely on forces beyond his control, on the benevolence of deities who maintained the patterns that made existence possible. In the palace, the pharaoh, who was himself considered a living god, a manifestation of Horus on earth, performed his own private rituals, aligning himself with Ra, acknowledging his role as intermediary between the divine and human realms, accepting the responsibility of ensuring that Ma'at prevailed in the land, that truth and justice were upheld, that chaos was kept at bay. Throughout Egypt, life continued, moment by moment, breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat, all synchronized with the greater rhythms of the cosmos, all participating in the vast pattern that Ra's journey made visible and tangible. The sun moved across the sky, the shadows shortened, the heat increased, and the world went about its business under the eternal watchful care of the gods, who never tired, never wavered, never failed in their commitment to maintain creation. The barge sailed on through the morning, approaching the zenith where Ra would sit in full glory at the peak of his power, where the light would be most intense and the shadows shortest, where high noon would divide the day into equal halves, the ascending and the descending, the waxing and the waning. This moment of perfect balance was still hours away, and the journey toward it unfolded with the patience that characterized all divine actions, without haste or delay, perfectly timed, absolutely reliable. The midday sun reached its zenith, and Ra sat upon his golden throne in a state of perfect stillness, embodying the absolute peak of solar power, the moment when light achieved its fullest expression, when shadows retreated to their smallest compass, when the world below was flooded with radiance so complete that every surface seemed to glow from within. This was the hour of maximum illumination, when truth stood most clearly revealed, when nothing could remain hidden, when the penetrating gaze of the sun god saw into every corner of creation, every hidden valley, every shadowed alcove, every secret place. The heat at this hour was intense but not oppressive, a clean, dry warmth that seemed to clarify rather than obscure, that brought everything into sharp focus, that made distant objects appear closer and more defined. The air shimmered slightly over the heated surfaces of stone and sand, creating those peculiar optical effects that blurred the boundary between earth and sky, that made the horizon waver and dance, that suggested the fluidity underlying all apparently solid forms. From his elevated position aboard the solar barge, Ra could see the full extent of the land he illuminated, the great river Nile flowing from south to north, its waters reflecting the sky in a ribbon of brilliant blue that cut through the tans and browns of the desert. He could see the green strips of fertile land on either side of the river, the fields and orchards and palm groves that depended upon the annual inundation for their existence, that grew and flourished in the narrow zone between water and desert, between abundance and scarcity. He could see the cities and temples, the villages and farmsteads, the roads and canals that connected them. He could see the people going about their midday activities, pausing in the shade to rest during the hottest hours, sharing simple meals of bread and beer, conversing in quiet voices about matters both mundane and profound. He could see the animals seeking shelter from the intense sun, the dogs lying in the shadows of walls, the cattle standing belly-deep in irrigation ditches, the birds perched motionless in the interior branches of trees. Beyond the cultivated lands, he could see the vast expanses of desert stretching away in all directions, the endless dunes sculpted by wind into graceful curves and sharp ridges, the rocky plateaus and barren mountains, the dry wadis that carried water only during the rare times of rain. This harsh landscape was beautiful in its own way, possessing a stark simplicity that appealed to something deep in the soul, a reminder that not all value resided in abundance, that austerity had its own lessons to teach, that emptiness was not the same as worthlessness. The gods who accompanied Ra on his journey maintained their positions on the barge, each fulfilling their particular role with the quiet competence that came from eons of practice. Thoth stood with his tablets, occasionally making a notation, recording events of significance that occurred in the world below, observations that would be preserved in the eternal archives, available for consultation by those with the wisdom and authority to access them. Horus kept his vigilant watch, though the dangers of the daylight hours were minimal compared to the perils of the night journey. Still, his warrior's training did not permit complacency, and his eyes continuously scanned the horizon, alert for any disturbance in the natural order, any indication that intervention might be required. His presence was a reassurance, a visible reminder that the forces of protection and justice stood ready to act in defense of Maat. Set had moved to the stern of the barge and stood looking back at the path they had traveled, at the eastern horizon now far behind them, at the wake of light that marked their passage across the sky. His wild energy was somewhat subdued during these peak hours of order and clarity, for his nature found fuller expression in liminal times and spaces, in the borderlands between day and night, in the transitional moments when the established patterns were most vulnerable to disruption. Maat remained at the center of the vessel, her presence creating an invisible axis around which everything else was organized. The feather she held had become almost translucent in the intense midday light, as though the truth it represented was so fundamental, so essential, that it barely needed physical manifestation, existing more as a principle than an object, more as a reality than a symbol. As the sun passed its zenith and began the slow descent toward the western horizon, a subtle shift occurred in the quality of the light. The change was imperceptible at first, something that could only be detected by comparison over extended periods, but gradually the fierce white brilliance of noon began to mellow, taking on warmer tones, yellows deepening toward gold, the harshness softening into something more gentle and forgiving. The shadows, which had been compressed into tight pools directly beneath objects at midday, began to lengthen once more, extending eastward as the sun moved westward, creating patterns of alternating light and shade that gave texture and depth to the landscape. These growing shadows were not threatening, but rather offered relief, provided respite from the intensity of the midday heat, created spaces of coolness where life could pause and refresh itself. The afternoon hours unfolded with the same measured grace that had characterized the morning, each moment perfectly balanced between what had been and what was yet to come, between the memory of the zenith and the anticipation of sunset. Time seemed to slow in these hours, to stretch and expand, allowing full appreciation of each passing moment, creating space for contemplation and reflection. Ra sat in quiet observation, his divine consciousness simultaneously focused and diffuse, attending to particular details while maintaining awareness of the totality, capable of seeing both the individual sparrow drinking at a puddle and the vast cosmic patterns that governed the movement of stars. This dual awareness was natural to him, not a skill that required cultivation, but rather an inherent aspect of his being, as fundamental as the light he emanated. In the temples below, the afternoon rituals were being performed, the second major cycle of offerings and prayers that marked the sun's descent toward evening. Priests moved through the sacred spaces with measured steps, carrying censers of smoking incense, reciting liturgies that had been passed down through countless generations, performing actions whose significance lay not in novelty, but in exact repetition, in faithful adherence to established patterns. The high priest in the great temple at Heliopolis, the city of the sun, approached the sanctuary where the cult image of Ra resided. This statue was more than mere carved stone. It was understood to be a dwelling place for the god's divine essence, a point of connection between the human and divine realms, a location where prayers could be directed with particular efficacy. The priest bowed deeply before entering, removing his sandals to walk barefoot on the cool stone floor, approaching with the reverence due to one addressing a god face to face. He carried offerings of bread and meat, flowers and fruit, beer and wine, all the products of the earth that existed only because Ra's light made them possible, now being returned to their ultimate source as gifts of gratitude and acknowledgement. The priest placed these offerings on the altar with careful precision, arranging them according to ancient prescriptions, ensuring that everything was exactly as it should be, that no detail was overlooked, that the ritual was performed with complete correctness. Then he began to chant, his voice rising in the enclosed space of the sanctuary, the acoustics designed to amplify and enrich the sound, to create an atmosphere of sacred power. The words he spoke were in the old language, the temple tongue that was no longer used for ordinary communication, but preserved exclusively for liturgical purposes, a language whose very unfamiliarity contributed to the sense of mystery and otherworldliness. Ra, aboard his solar barge far above, heard these prayers as he heard all prayers, not as sounds traveling through air, but as direct communications to his divine consciousness, as intentions and devotions that registered immediately in his awareness, regardless of distance or intervening obstacles. He received them without judgment or evaluation, simply acknowledging their presence, accepting the offerings in the spirit they were given, adding his blessing to the lives of those who sought to maintain proper relationship with the divine. Throughout the land, similar scenes were unfolding in temples great and small, in grand edifices of carved stone and modest shrines of mud brick, in public spaces and private homes. The worship of Ra was not confined to professional priests, but extended to all people, for everyone benefited from the sun's light, everyone depended on its constancy. Everyone had reason for gratitude toward the God who maintained the cosmic order. A farmer in his field paused in his work and looked up at the sun, now past its peak, but still powerful, still warm, still life-giving. He spoke no elaborate prayer, but simply stood in silence for a moment, hands resting on the handle of his hoe, feeling the heat on his face and arms, acknowledging in wordless recognition the source of the abundance that surrounded him, the green shoots rising from the dark soil, the promise of harvest contained in those tender plants. An old woman sitting in the doorway of her house, too elderly now for heavy labor, watched her grandchildren playing in the dusty street, their laughter bright in the afternoon air. She thought about all the years she had seen the sun rise and set, all the days that had accumulated into a lifetime, and she felt a deep gratitude for the gift of existence, for the opportunity to have lived, to have loved, to have participated in the great pattern of human life under the watchful care of the gods. A merchant traveling along the river road paused to water his donkey at a public trough, using the brief stop to also refresh himself, drinking deeply from the cool water drawn from the Nile, feeling it restore his energy and focus. He glanced up at the sun to gauge the time, calculating how many more hours of daylight remained, whether he would reach the next town before dark. His relationship with Ra was practical and immediate, based on the simple facts of navigation and schedule, yet no less sincere for being utilitarian. All of these moments of awareness, of acknowledgement, of connection, registered in Ra's divine consciousness as variations on a single theme. The recognition by created beings of their relationship to the creative source, the instinctive understanding that existence was not random or accidental, but rather sustained by powers that transcended individual life, that the light and warmth so essential to survival came from a God who had chosen to take on the burden of providing them. The solar barge continued its stately progress across the afternoon sky, the journey now more than halfway complete, the western horizon growing imperceptibly closer with each passing moment. The gods aboard maintained their vigilance, their dedication never wavering, their commitment to the sacred task as strong in the 1000th hour of the day as it had been in the first. Thoth calculated the precise angle of the sun's descent, ensuring that the trajectory remained true, that the sunset would occur at exactly the right moment and in exactly the right location, that the delicate balance between day and night was preserved. His mathematical understanding was not cold or abstract, but rather infused with reverence for the patterns he described, the recognition that behind every equation lay profound mysteries, that numbers themselves were divine principles made manifest. Horus felt the subtle shift in the atmosphere that always accompanied the afternoon hours, the way the energy of the day began to turn inward, to become more reflective and less outward directed. This was not yet evening, not yet the time when shadows would gather and merge, but rather the beginning of that transition, the first hint that the day would not last forever, that night would come as it always came, that the cycle would complete itself once more. Set grew more alert as the hours advanced, sensing the approach of evening, knowing that as the light began to fade, his particular skills would become more relevant, that the transition times were his domain, that the crossing between day and night required the kind of vigilant strength he embodied. He was not eager for conflict, but rather prepared for whatever might come, accepting his role without complaint or reluctance. Mot's position at the center of the barge remained unchanged, but the quality of her presence somehow intensified as the day progressed toward its conclusion, as though the approaching evening required a stronger assertion of order, a clearer statement of the principles that prevented the descent into chaos. Her feather caught the mellowing light and seemed to glow from within, a steady beacon of truth in a world of constant change. The shadows continued to lengthen as the afternoon advanced, stretching further and further eastward, becoming attenuated and diffuse at their edges, while remaining darker and more clearly defined near their source. These shadows transformed the landscape, creating depth and dimension, revealing contours and textures that had been flattened by the overhead light of midday. What had appeared plain and simple at noon now showed itself to be complex and varied, full of subtle gradations and unexpected details. The temperature began to drop as well, not dramatically but noticeably, the fierce heat of midday giving way to something more moderate and comfortable. This cooling was welcomed by all living things, a relief that allowed renewed activity after the forced stillness of the hottest hours. People emerged from their shelters and resumed their work, taking advantage of the more pleasant conditions, hurrying to complete tasks before the sun set and darkness made labor difficult. In the fields, farmers moved along the irrigation ditches, opening gates to allow water to flow into areas that needed it, closing others to prevent flooding in sections where the moisture level was adequate. The sound of moving water was soothing and constant, a liquid music that spoke of abundance and careful management, of human cooperation with natural processes, of the successful cultivation of a landscape that would otherwise be barren. Birds became more active in the late afternoon, their songs filling the air with melodic complexity, patterns of sound that wove together into a symphony of avian voices. Some were calls of territory, males asserting their claims to particular areas, warning others to keep their distance. Some were conversations between mates, maintaining the bonds that held pairs together, coordinating the tasks of nest building and chick rearing. Some seemed to be pure expressions of vitality, songs sung for the simple joy of singing, celebrations of existence offered to the afternoon air. The solar barge passed over the great city of Thebes, and Ra gazed down at the monumental architecture that human hands had created in his honor and in honor of the other gods. The massive pylons of the temple complexes cast long shadows across the plazas and processional ways. The tall obelisks, covered in gold leaf that caught the sun's light and threw it back in brilliant reflection, stood like fingers pointing toward the sky, asserting the connection between earth and heaven, between mortal and divine realms. Within the temples, the afternoon rituals were reaching their climax, the final prayers and offerings being made before the transition to evening protocols. The sacred singers raised their voices in harmonious chords, their training evident in the precision of their pitch and timing, their devotion manifest in the emotional quality they brought to the ancient words. The music rose through the high clerestory windows and drifted up toward the solar barge, another form of offering, another expression of humanity's relationship with the divine. Ra felt a deep satisfaction as he observed these acts of worship, not because he required adulation or needed the ego gratification of being praised, but because these rituals represented the healthy functioning of the cosmic order, the proper relationship between created beings and the sources of their creation. When humans honored the gods with sincere devotion, they were simultaneously honoring the principles those gods embodied, aligning themselves with truth and justice and order, choosing to participate consciously in the patterns that sustained existence. The angle of the sun's light continued to decrease as the afternoon advanced toward evening, the rays now slanting across the landscape at increasingly oblique angles, creating a quality of illumination that was both gentle and dramatic. Surfaces that faced the descending sun were bathed in warm golden light that seemed to emanate from within the materials themselves, while surfaces facing away fell into shadows that were deep but not yet complete, still holding traces of reflected light, still revealing some detail and texture. The Nile, that great artery of Egyptian civilization, became a river of gold in this slanting light, its surface reflecting the sun's radiance in countless tiny mirrors, each ripple and wave catching and throwing back the light, creating a shimmering path that seemed almost solid enough to walk upon, a golden road that connected the cultivated lands to the descending sun itself. Along the river's banks, fishermen were drawing in their nets, examining their catch, sorting the fish by size and type, setting aside some for their own families, and preparing the rest for sale in the markets. The work was done with practiced efficiency, hands moving automatically through tasks performed thousands of times before, leaving the mind free to wander, to think about other matters, to observe the beauty of the late afternoon light on the water. A heron stood motionless in the shallows, its long legs barely disturbing the surface, its keen eyes focused on the water below, watching for the movement that would trigger its lightning strike, the quick thrust of its spear-like beak that would secure its evening meal. The bird was patience personified, willing to wait as long as necessary, understanding at some instinctive level that stillness and attention would eventually be rewarded, that the river would provide if approached with the right combination of alertness and calm. The solar barge had now traveled more than 3/4 of its daily course, and the western horizon was no longer a distant abstraction, but a visible destination, the point toward which all motion was directed, the gateway between the upper world and the Duat. The sky in that direction was beginning to show the first signs of the dramatic transformation that would accompany sunset, the blue taking on subtle hints of other colors, pale yellows and soft oranges that announced the approaching climax of the day. Ra felt the pull of the western horizon growing stronger, the same pull he had felt every day since the beginning of time. The call of the Duat, the summons to the night journey that would follow this day journey as surely as darkness followed light. There was no resistance in him to this call, no reluctance to leave the bright clarity of day for the mysterious passages of night, for he understood that both were equally necessary, equally sacred, equally essential to the maintenance of creation. The other gods prepared themselves for the transition that would soon occur, each making subtle adjustments to their positions and their consciousness, readying themselves for the shift from the relatively peaceful day journey to the more challenging night passage. They had made this transition countless times, would make it countless times more, yet each occasion was treated with full attention and respect, for complacency was the enemy of proper function, and the sacred task required constant mindfulness. As the sun descended closer to the horizon, the pace of activity increased in the world below, people hurrying to complete their daily tasks before darkness fell. This was the busy time, the productive time, when the worst of the day's heat had passed, but sufficient light remained for work, when energy returned after the forced rest of midday, when there was urgency, but not yet anxiety, when much could still be accomplished if one worked with focus and efficiency. Bakers pulled their final loaves from the ovens, the crust golden brown and fragrant, the interior soft and steaming. These loaves would be sold in the evening markets, purchased by families for their evening meals, broken and shared around humble tables in homes throughout the land, sustaining bodies that sustained households, that sustained villages, that sustained the entire civilization. Potters turned their wheels, shaping wet clay into vessels of various sizes and purposes, using skills passed down through generations, adding their own small refinements and innovations while maintaining the essential forms that had proven their utility through centuries of use. The rotating wheel was hypnotic in its motion, the emerging form seeming to grow almost organically from the shapeless lump, responding to the potter's touch with fluid grace. Weavers worked at their looms, shuttles passing back and forth through the vertical threads, gradually creating fabric from individual strands, building complexity from simple elements, transforming raw material into finished goods through patient, repetitive action. The rhythm of weaving was soothing and meditative, allowing the mind to settle into a peaceful state while the hands continued their skilled work. All of this activity, all of these individual lives and labors, unfolded under the watchful presence of Ra, who saw everything, who missed nothing, whose divine awareness encompassed the totality of existence, while remaining capable of attending to the smallest detail. He was not merely a passive observer, but an active participant in the cosmic order, his very presence sustaining the patterns that made life possible, his light providing the energy that powered all growth, all movement, all change. The sun touched the western horizon, the lower edge of the solar disk, making contact with the distant line where Earth met sky. This moment marked the beginning of sunset proper, the culmination of the day's journey, the transition point that would lead to evening and eventually to night. The transformation of the sky accelerated now, colors deepening and intensifying, the entire western third of the heavens becoming a canvas for one of nature's most spectacular displays. The bottom of the sky near the horizon blazed with deep oranges and reds, colors so saturated they seemed almost unnatural, almost impossible, as though the boundary between day and night were marked by fire. Above these intense hues, the colors faded through gradations of yellow and gold, blending eventually into the still blue portions of the sky overhead, creating a continuum of color that spanned the entire visible spectrum. Clouds, if any were present, became illuminated from below, their undersides catching the sun's last rays and glowing with reflected radiance, appearing as though lit from within by some internal source. These clouds stood out against the darkening background of the upper sky, creating dramatic contrasts, drawing the eye upward and across the vast dome of the heavens. Ra sat motionless on his throne as the barge descended toward the horizon, his form silhouetted against the brilliant sky, his light now so intense and rich in color that to look directly at him would be painful for mortal eyes. This was the sun in its most dramatic aspect, neither the harsh white blaze of midday nor the gentle glow of a light dawn, but rather something between, something that combined power and beauty in equal measure, something that inspired awe and wonder in all who witnessed it. The people below paused in their evening tasks to watch the sunset, drawn by an instinct older than civilization, older than language, older than conscious thought. Something deep in the human spirit responded to this daily spectacle, recognizing it as significant, as worthy of attention, as deserving of that rarest of commodities in a busy life. A moment of pure observation without utilitarian purpose, a brief span of time given over entirely to witnessing beauty for its own sake. In the temples, the evening rituals began, the third major cycle of worship in the daily round, marking the sun's descent and expressing the hope and faith that it would successfully complete its night journey and return again in the morning. Torches and oil lamps were lit, their flickering flames pale and weak compared to the dying sunlight, but representing humanity's determination to maintain light even in the darkness, to push back against the shadows, to create small spaces of illumination where life could continue. The high priest offered prayers for Ra's safe passage through the Duat, invoking the protection of the gods who accompanied him, calling upon Set to defend the solar barge against Apophis, asking Thoth to guide the way with his wisdom, requesting Horus to keep watch with his keen sight, beseeching Mot to maintain the order that kept chaos at bay. These prayers had been offered every evening for time beyond memory, and they would be offered every evening for time yet to come, a continual affirmation of faith and trust in the divine order. The sun sank lower, now half visible above the horizon, half descended into the underworld, balanced perfectly between the upper world and the Duat, existing in both realms simultaneously, the ultimate expression of the liminal, the threshold, the boundary between states. This moment of exact balance lasted only briefly, a heartbeat, a breath, and then the descent continued, the visible portion of the sun growing smaller with each passing moment. The colors in the sky reached their peak intensity, the reds deepening toward purple, the oranges taking on hints of pink, the whole western sky seeming to pulse with barely contained energy, as though the day were not going gently but rather burning out in a final blaze of glory. This intensity would not last long. Already the upper portions of the sky were darkening, the blue fading toward indigo, the first stars beginning to appear, faint points of light that gained strength as the ambient brightness diminished. Ra felt the transition beginning, the change from Ra, the day sun, to Ra Osiris, the night sun, the merging with the Lord of the Underworld that would allow him to navigate the realm of the dead. This transformation was as familiar as his own existence, yet he gave it full attention and respect, for it was a sacred mystery, a profound truth about the nature of divinity and existence, the way all things flowed into one another, the way boundaries were both real and permeable, the way identity could be both fixed and fluid. The solar barge tilted downward, angling into the gateway that opened in the western horizon, the entrance to the Duat that appeared at precisely this moment each day, that existed only for the purpose of allowing Ra's passage, that would close again once he had entered, sealing the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The gods braced themselves slightly, not because the passage was rough, but because the transition required adjustment, required a shift in consciousness and awareness, required acceptance of different rules and different realities. The last sliver of the sun disappeared below the horizon, and for a moment the sky seemed to hold its breath, suspended between day and night, between light and darkness, between two states without being fully either. Then the moment passed, and evening truly began, the sky continuing to darken, the stars multiplying and brightening, the landscape below falling into shadow, the day officially ended. But this ending was not final or permanent. It was merely one phase of an eternal cycle, one movement in a cosmic dance that had no beginning and would have no end. The sun had set, but it had not ceased to exist. It had merely passed from one realm to another, from the visible world to the hidden world, from the domain of the living to the domain of the dead, and in the deep hours of night it would pass through its trials and tribulations, would face Apophis once more, would emerge victorious once more, and would return tomorrow morning to begin the journey anew. In the gathering darkness, the people of Egypt prepared for the night ahead, lighting their lamps and candles, gathering their families together, sharing their evening meals, telling stories and singing songs, maintaining the human warmth and connection that made the darkness bearable, that created small circles of light and life in the vast shadows. They trusted that the sun would return, not as a matter of blind faith, but as a reasonable conclusion based on countless prior experiences, based on the reliability of the cosmic order, based on their understanding of Ra's dedication to his eternal task. The priests in the temples continued their rituals through the night, maintaining the connection with the divine realm, ensuring that the prayers and offerings never ceased, that humanity never abandoned its end of the relationship, that the gods knew they were remembered and honored even in the darkest hours. This vigilance was both duty and privilege, both obligation and opportunity, both work and worship. Ra's barge descended deeper into the Duat, the familiar passage now illuminated only by the dimmed light of his night sun aspect, the walls closing in on either side, the journey through the 12 hours of night beginning once again. The gods took their positions, Set preparing for the inevitable confrontation with Apophis, Thoth consulting his tablets and calculating the course, Horus scanning the darkness for threats, Mate maintaining her central position, her feather glowing softly in the shadows. The first hour of the night journey passed, and then the second, the barge moving through regions they had traversed countless times before, encountering the familiar landmarks and inhabitants of the underworld, exchanging greetings with the souls of the blessed dead, acknowledging the guardians who watched over the various passages and gateways. The journey had its own rhythm, its own sequence of events, its own internal logic and structure. In the world above, true night had fallen, the stars now brilliant in the darkened sky, the moon rising to follow its own path across the heavens, adding its gentler light to the darkness. The Nile reflected both stars and moon, becoming a ribbon of silver and shadow, beautiful in a different way from its golden afternoon appearance, but no less striking, no less worthy of appreciation. Night creatures emerged to take advantage of the darkness, hunting and foraging, going about their own lives and purposes, participating in their own cycles that interwove with, but remained distinct from human cycles. Bats swooped through the air, catching insects in flight, their high-pitched cries inaudible to human ears, but creating a sonic landscape by which they navigated. Jackals trotted through the desert, alert for any opportunity, their eyes reflecting any available light, their survival depending on keen senses and quick reactions. In homes throughout the land, people settled down to sleep, bodies tired from the day's labor, minds ready for the rest and restoration that night would bring. Parents tucked children into bed, speaking soft words of comfort and reassurance, helping the little ones make the transition from waking consciousness to sleep, from activity to rest, from the known world of daylight to the mysterious realm of dreams. An old man lay on his sleeping mat, gazing up at the ceiling of his modest home, thinking about his life, about all the years that had passed, about all the sunrises and sunsets he had witnessed. He felt a deep peace, not because his life had been without difficulty or sorrow, but because he had learned to accept the cycles, to trust in the patterns, to understand that the alternation between day and night, between activity and rest, between life and death, was not a flaw in creation, but rather its fundamental nature, the way things were meant to be. A young woman, newly married, lay beside her sleeping husband, listening to the sound of his breathing, feeling grateful for his presence, for the partnership they were building together, for the future they would create. She whispered a brief prayer to Hathor, goddess of love and marriage, asking for blessings on their union, for children to fill their home, for long life and happiness. The prayer was simple and sincere, arising from the heart rather than from memorized liturgy, and therefore perhaps more powerful in its directness. In the Duat, Ra's barge continued its journey through the middle hours of the night, approaching once again the seventh hour, the dangerous passage where Apophis waited in the darkness, where the confrontation would occur that had occurred every night since time began. The gods tensed slightly, preparing themselves, knowing what was coming, ready to fulfill their roles in the eternal drama of order confronting chaos. And once again, as it had happened countless times before, Apophis emerged from the depths, his massive serpentine form coiling in the darkness, his presence radiating malevolence and negation, his entire being dedicated to ending the journey, to swallowing the sun, to bringing about the final darkness that would unmake creation itself. The battle began, Set leaping forward with his spear, Thoth weaving his protective spells, Horus calling out warnings and guidance, Mot standing firm at the center, her truth unyielding. The confrontation raged for its allotted time, neither side giving ground easily, the outcome never certain, despite the countless precedents, for each battle was unique, each required the full commitment and effort of all involved, each had to be fought and won anew. Apophis struck again and again, seeking to overwhelm the defenses, to find some weakness, some gap through which he could reach Ra and achieve his eternal goal. But Set met every attack, his spear finding its mark, his strength equal to the serpent's malice, his dedication absolute. Gradually, as always, the balance shifted in favor of order, the combined power of the gods proving sufficient to drive back the chaos serpent, to force him to retreat once more into the deepest shadows, to concede another night's battle, while remaining committed to eternal opposition. Set delivered the final blow, his spear driving deep into Apophis's skull, not killing but banishing, not destroying but dispersing, sending the great enemy back into the dark from which he had emerged. The immediate danger passed, and the barge continued its journey through the remaining hours of night, ascending gradually toward the eastern horizon, moving from darkness toward the first hints of approaching dawn. The 8th hour brought renewed hope. The 9th hour showed clear signs of transition. The 10th hour revealed the growing light. The 11th hour made dawn certain, and the 12th hour brought them to the final chamber, the place of transformation where night became day. Ra stood at the edge of the pool in the chamber of transformation, lowering his hands into the primordial waters, feeling their power, absorbing their energy. The other gods arranged themselves in their circle, chanting the ancient words, facilitating the change from Ra Osiris back to Ra, from night sun to day sun, from the Lord of the hidden realm to the Lord of the visible world. The transformation occurred, gradual and complete, and Ra rose in his full daylight glory, his light blazing forth, his form radiant with golden splendor. The barrier between the Duat and the upper world dissolved, and the solar barge emerged into the pre-dawn grayness, ascending immediately toward its proper position in the sky. The eastern horizon brightened rapidly, the darkness fleeing before the advancing light, the stars fading one by one until only the brightest remained, stubborn pinpoints refusing to acknowledge defeat until the last possible moment. And then, once again, as it had happened every morning since the beginning of creation, the first rays of the rising sun broke over the eastern horizon, lancing across the dark landscape, bringing definition and detail, bringing warmth and life, bringing the beginning of a new day. The solar disk emerged fully, climbing steadily into the lightening sky, beginning once more its journey across the heavens, repeating the pattern that had been repeated countless times and would be repeated countless times more. In the temples, the priests cried out in joy and relief, welcoming the return of Ra, offering their morning prayers and praises, performing the rituals that began each day. In homes and villages, people emerged to witness the sunrise, to feel its warmth on their faces, to give thanks for another day of life, another opportunity to participate in existence, another chance to grow and learn and love. The world came alive in the dawn light, birds singing, animals stirring, plants turning their leaves toward the sun, the whole biosphere responding to the return of the light source that made everything possible. The Nile caught the early rays and began its transformation from silver to gold, flowing serenely between its banks, carrying water and silt and life throughout the land. Ra sat upon his golden throne as the barge climbed into the morning sky, his journey beginning anew, his dedication unchanged, his commitment absolute. The other gods took their daytime positions, settling into the rhythm of the day journey, maintaining their vigilance, fulfilling their roles. The cycle continued, unbroken and unbreakable, eternal and ever-renewing, the great pattern that gave structure and meaning to existence. A young child, waking in her bed as sunlight streamed through the window, sat up and rubbed her eyes, looking at the new day with wonder and excitement. Everything was possibility, everything was potential, everything was fresh and new, though the sun that lit her room was the same sun that had risen countless times before. She ran outside to greet the morning, her joy uncontained, her energy boundless, her life just beginning its own journey, its own cycle, its own participation in the great pattern. An elderly priest, having witnessed thousands of sunrises in his long life of service, stood in the temple courtyard and watched the sun climb higher, his heart full of gratitude and peace. He had dedicated his entire life to Ra, to the maintenance of the rituals, to the preservation of the sacred knowledge, and he did not regret a moment of that dedication. Soon his own journey would end, his own life would close its cycle, but the sun would continue to rise, the pattern would persist, and others would take up the tasks he would leave behind. The solar barge sailed on through the morning, approaching midday, the journey continuing its eternal course. Nothing had changed, yet everything was renewed. The pattern remained constant, yet each iteration was unique. The cycle repeated endlessly, yet never became meaningless or empty, for it was the cycle itself that gave meaning, that provided structure, that made existence comprehensible and bearable. In the rhythm of day and night, in the alternation of light and darkness, in the eternal journey of the sun across the sky and through the underworld, lay a profound truth about the nature of existence. Nothing,